Now, number one, we know race is not real. White, black, African, Asian, European, all these different racial and ethnic categories that we put each other into are all social constructs. They're all man-made constructs used to label different people with man-made words from man-made languages. Nobody's coming out of the womb thinking that they're an African or a European. These are concepts that are bred into us by our environment, by society. No child is born thinking that they are these things. Race, ethnicity, nationality, it all has to be bred into the mind of a human being. So we know this particular thought process of race, nationality, ethnicity is not the natural state of a human being. You don't grow into knowing that you're an Asian or an African. You're told that you are, and you accept it. Now, that being said, all these different racial categories, ethnic categories, and all the different nationalities that we've separated into have all been formed from these very basic differences that actually exist amongst human beings. Our different phenotypes, so basically facial features, and different skin tones that vary amongst different human beings. This is the only thing that truly separates us. When you take away everything that is man-made, everything that has been brought to existence from the mind of a human being, you take all of that away and you get down to the core of what actually exists, what's actually real, then our only differences are our phenotypes and our skin tones. And then you dig into it even more and you look at human beings on a global scale, and it becomes clear that you have beings all over the world that have different skin tones, but all share the same phenotypes, the same eye type, the same lip type, the same nose, the same hair textures, the same overall bone structure. And the only difference, the only thing separating these human beings is skin tone. At the core of the human diaspora, the only thing truly separating human beings is our different shades of skin. And then if we get into the biological reasons of what is causing these different skin tones, and look at this thing on a molecular level, it comes down to two distinctly different forms of melanin. Because we know everything in nature has melanin, including human beings. Every single human being possesses melanin. But amongst human beings, you have these very two distinct forms, eumelanin and pheomelanin, with eumelanin giving you your black to brown pigments and pheomelanin creating almost a pink pigment or a yellow to white pigment. So eumelanin is giving you your darker tones and pheomelanin is giving you your lighter tones. And then the reason that we appear to be these different tones is because of the different wavelengths of light that reflect off of us on a molecular level. And these different wavelengths of light come from the sun as it beams down its light onto the earth. And each one of these individual wavelengths of light is actually formed by a specific element. Each individual wavelength of light is connected to a specific element because the sun is composed of every single basic fundamental element: nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, iron, and the list goes on. Every single predominant element can be found in the sun. And each and every one of these elements is connected to a specific color. And the sun is sending out these wavelengths of these elements, these light rays. And then these light rays are either being absorbed or reflected by us, depending on our different forms of melanin. And so when we see these different skin tones in human beings, we're actually seeing a combination of those different color elements coming together to give us one neutral tone. And we can see this on a basic level when we look at how those same primary colors that we find in the sun's light spectrum can be combined together to create the exact same tones that we see in human beings. So you would think what we're seeing is an example of those elements within those light rays being reflected and absorbed within human beings. And then looking at how colors are formed, you need at least three primary colors from the color spectrum to create brown. And then the more primary colors you add, the darker that brown is going to become. And vice versa. The less primary colors you combine together, the lighter that tone is going to become until you start getting down to tan and ultimately white, which is all of those colors removed. So it's safe to think that the same thing is going on when we look at all the variations of skin tones within human beings, that we're seeing the reflection of those different colors of elements being mixed together or absorbed by melanin, and basically seeing the different color wavelengths of those elements being manifested into one combined solid tone. Because this is true for every single thing that we see. Every single thing that we see is getting its color from the light rays that it is reflecting or absorbing, all the way down the color spectrum from black to white. You have those different extremes of the absorption and reflection of the elements of light. When we see black, we are seeing all light being absorbed. And when we see white, we are seeing all light being reflected. And then, of course, you have all those variations in between. But again, looking at melanin, we can look at melanin and we can see that melanin is made up of all of these different elements. But out of all of these elements, the most prevalent element we find in melanin is carbon. And we know all elements come in 3 different forms, either as a gas, a liquid, or a solid. And when you look at carbon in its solid form, you'll see that it's a dark black substance, just like melanin. So from this, we basically got to conclude that the thing that's making the melanin substance as black or as darkly pigmented as it is must be carbon. And then in turn, you got to think, if carbon is responsible for bringing out that black pigmentation in melanin, is carbon also responsible for the darker shades of pigmentation we see in human beings? We know melanin is the key to our different skin pigmentations as human beings. But again, looking at all these other elements, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon literally is the only element out of all these elements that would seem like it would really play a key role in creating the darker pigmentations that we see across the board in human beings. Now again, carbon is black. It's a black substance. But what is black? Now, of course, we have our primary colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And each one of these colors correlates with a specific element found on the periodic table and found in our sun. Now, from 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, you can get brown. You can mix these 3 primary colors up in different combinations and get different shades of brown, lighter and darker shades of brown. So you mix yellow and red together and you get one shade of brown. You add blue and you start getting some deeper, more defined shades of brown. Then you can even start mixing 2 different browns together, and that leads to even deeper, darker, more defined shades of brown. But doing all these separate combinations of the primary colors and the brown shades is always going to lead you to a different shade of brown. But you will never quite get black from mixing all these small combinations of colors together. You can try different small combinations of all these primary colors, mixing them together, and you will always come up short of getting black. The only way you can get black is by mixing every primary color together. So when you mix red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet all together, you're going to find that you will get black. Black is literally a combination of every single primary color. So when we see the color black within our visual spectrum, what we think we're seeing as black is actually every single primary color all combined as one. And you got to remember, the sun And stars in general emit a spectrum of different color lights. And each one of these colors correlates with a particular element on the periodic table. And black absorbs light. Black is the absorption of light. And again, we have all of these elements radiating within the spectrum of light. So when we see black, we're actually seeing the absorption of all colors, the absorption of all elements. Now again, carbon in its solid form is a black substance, a dark black substance. And our very own complexions found in human beings most likely comes from these carbon atoms we find in the melanin cellular structure. So the next question is, what is carbon in its purest form? What would that look like? What does that look like? So yes, Vanta Black is basically carbon, vertically aligned carbon nanotubes. And a carbon nanotube is just literally a tubular form of carbon. It's basically carbon molecules bonded together in this cylinder form. What they're really saying when they say carbon nanotubes is they're saying a bond of carbon atoms. So we have a bonding of carbon atoms to create this material known as Vanta Black. And we have a bonding of carbon atoms obviously in the solid form. So we're seeing solid carbon bonded together, and what that should look like, or what that does look like in its native form. This is just pure carbon atoms bonded together, and what they will look like on the surface in a physical form. The first thing you're going to find is that Vanta Black is considered the blackest known substance on Earth. They say it absorbs about 99.965% of all visible radiation. So it absorbs almost all light rays around it. Any visible light surrounding this thing in its small little vicinity that it's in, it absorbs that. And again, remember, with the color black, the reason we see black as black is because it's absorbing all of this light, all of these different color light rays. All color in the visible spectrum is being absorbed by this color known as black. And again, this is simply just carbon atoms bonded together to create this coating of pure carbon, pure solid carbon on the surface. And again, you got to think, with carbon being the most prevalent element found in melanin, and the only element in melanin that we know could produce the dark pigmentation that we see in human beings. So it just makes you think, what would a human being who contains that pure melanin polymer with that pure coating of carbon covering their bodies, what does that human being look like? I don't think we've seen it. I know we see what we perceive to be a lot of dark people out there, or black people out there, but are they black or are they just darker browns? I haven't seen a human being on planet Earth that is to this point of carbonation on the surface level. Now, none of us, as far as I know, again, were there to see the original human beings, or what we would perceive to be the original human beings, if there was even an original. We don't even know how far this thing goes. But just based off of what science is telling us, and scientifically, it would seem like what we would have walking around is human beings that were extremely carbonated, on a level that we probably couldn't even wrap our heads around. It'd probably scare a lot of us to see it today. And then again, with these colors representing different elements, that means that when you see the color black, you're seeing the absorption of every single element. But then, like we talked about before, you cannot get brown from black without eliminating something. If you don't eliminate something, you're always going to have black. There's no way around that unless you eliminate something. Unless you eliminate a color, aka unless you eliminate an element, you're always going to have black. So the only way we could have gotten brown skin on this planet was to eliminate something, to eliminate one or more of those elements from the human melanin polymer. And you just keep removing those elements, going down the line of all the different lighter shades of brown skin. So looking at that science, you're basically looking at the fleshing out of all these different elements from the melanin polymer. So with that being said, with that simple science alone, we already know just from that science that black had to be first on this planet. If you have to remove all these other elements to get all these other skin tones that we see on this planet right now, then black had to be the first. Not the black that we've been programmed to associate with human beings all over the planet of different brown shades of skin, because that's really what we have. We have a bunch of brown skinned people walking around calling themselves black. When you look at that one particular color that we all see as black based off of the English language, and you compare it to quote unquote black people all across the planet, it's clear to see that we do not match up with that color. I just think to be able to understand the science behind human origins and why we are brown, you got to first realize the reality that we are brown. We are not black. I mean, if you want to get to true black, that type of black that absorbs all light, all color, all elements, you will find that in carbon. And we do see that to an extent in human beings. We got human beings that stretch really deep into the spectrum of darker pigmentation. We see a lot of darker tones out there. And this is even backed up by anthropologists who are telling us that somewhere within the last 6,000 years, give or take 1,000, some type of change took place within the human genome, and light skin was literally introduced onto the planet. That it wasn't always here, that is basically a new phenomenon. And that prior to this happening, every human being on planet Earth was dark skinned. Now, how dark? They won't say. Is that based off of science, basic science of color? There's just no way we could have gotten brown or any other shades going down the line from brown without first having black. And when you look at the way the human body is constructed, the human body having every single element necessary to create every single wavelength of color, and then the very substance controlling the color of our skin, the pigmentation of our skin being dominated by carbon, it just looks to me like biologically the human body was constructed and human beings were created to be these dark matter beings, these completely black beings. Now, there was a guy that worked as a mechanical engineer at NASA named Norman Bergrun, and most people are probably familiar with him. And he wrote a book in 1986 called The Ringmakers of Saturn. Now, in his book, The Ringmakers of Saturn, Norman Bergrun pointed out some of the odd things that he noticed while looking at the images from the Voyager probe. And basically, he noticed that when looking at the same exact section of Saturn's rings from two separate probes, the rings looked different. The same exact section that was photographed by Voyager 1 looked a lot different when it was photographed by Voyager 2. It actually looked like the rings were expanding or growing from one image to the next. So he kept looking deeper into all the photographs of Saturn from the Cassini probe and the Voyager probe. And he started to pinpoint what he thought to look like these bright objects. He called them luminous sources hanging around the rings of Saturn. And the more he analyzed these things, the more he noticed that wherever he saw these luminous sources, he also saw these long, narrow, bright lines. And they looked like they had some type of structure to them. And he started to propose that these luminous sources or these light sources were coming from these structures and were like some type of residue coming off of these structures that seemed to be attaching themselves to the rings of Saturn. And as he started analyzing them more, he started to notice even more of the structure of these objects, and that it was almost shaped like a cylinder. And that's when he started referring to these things as vehicles. And because he was always spotting them near the edges of the rings of Saturn, and because of that drastic change in the size of the rings of Saturn that he had seen between Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, he started to theorize that either these vehicles were forming the rings of Saturn, siphoning material from the rings of Saturn, or both. And so with all that in mind, he started referring to these things as electromagnetic vehicles, aka the ring makers of Saturn. And because of everything that he had come across in his data, he pretty much believed that anywhere where you could find rings around a planet, you could also find these vehicles. And he believed that there was a good chance that they were all over the solar system. Now, eventually he did an interview about his findings, and this thing ended up going viral. A lot of people have seen it. And in the interview, he was asked if he had come across any evidence of there being actual sentient life inside these vehicles.
From Project Camelot, we are here with Norm Bergram. He was with NACA, which was the early precursor of NASA.
Yes.
And he also worked for Ames Research. He has also worked for Lockheed Martin before it was Lockheed Martin. And he has written a book called The Ring Makers of Saturn. And so when you're talking about the craft in the rings of Saturn, you're talking about something huge, right?
Yes.
Much bigger than we could even conceive of.
I could, in looking down on the rings, I could see parallel lines crossing the ring, all the rings at once. Mm-hmm. That's about as long as you can get them.
That's incredible.
But I could tell that those lines demarked the outside of an object.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I came up with the scale I present in there of different lengths of these things.
Well, did we build it?
Pardon?
Did we build it? Who built it? The craft?
I don't know who built it, but what I found out is these things inhabit Saturn. That's where I first discovered them, and they're proliferating. They're now at Uranus and Jupiter. Wherever you see some rings now, why, that's one of these. You
see the craft?
Yeah, I call it a ring maker. Yeah.
Okay, you call it a ring maker.
Yeah.
Okay, but if there are craft, there are beings.
Okay, people have asked me about, I call them vehicles, okay?
Right.
Now, I did not call them objects. That was too neuter for me.
Okay.
I had a Stanford professor said you ought to call them objects. No. They have all of the qualities of a vehicle. Mm-hmm. They can move. You know, they're just like a missile or anything like that. So that much we can say about them, for sure.
Okay.
So I'm calling it a vehicle.
Okay. So are you not positing the idea that those vehicles contain, beings who are, maybe like us?
Yeah, I only go along with government images. And if you want to know about people kind of thing, there is the ship that picked up the Voyager capsule at Alameda Naval Shipyard, and they have a picture there of I think it's the Apollo flight that Buzz and Neil were on. But anyway, there is one image there that shows black people getting off.
So people with dark skin getting off.
Not dark, black.
Black skin.
Really black. Yeah.
Were they tall?
Yes.
Very tall?
Yeah.
How tall? Do you know?
Well, they got out the doorway. I don't know how high that is, but
Well, what?
it's safe. 7 feet would be probably a conservative estimate.
Have you heard about Clark McClellan's statement about that?
No,
Oh, you haven't?
no,
Have you ever been in touch with him?
no.
No?
I have tried to stay independent and not be affected by others' opinions.
Do you believe that we're communicating with them? Have you had any evidence of that?
Oh, no. You
No?
know, we are not capable of doing that. SETI has tried to communicate with extraterrestrials, and they haven't done it yet. They have chosen the type of person, the type of entity that they want to communicate with is somebody that knows how to build radios.
Right.
That constrains them in their thinking
Yes.
immensely.
Now, we all know there are just two forms of melanin separating human beings. Eumelanin and pheomelanin. And of course, eumelanin comes in those two distinct forms. Black eumelanin and brown eumelanin. Now, out of these three variations of melanin, the only variation that we don't see expressed physically in the human genome is black eumelanin. But we know scientifically, without that black eumelanin, we wouldn't even be able to have these other forms of melanin. Because in order to get these other tones, brown, etc., you first need black. And as you remove elements from black, you start to get all these other variations of color. You would think that black eumelanin would have to have come first. But again, black eumelanin is something that we don't see expressed physically in any human being on this planet. But again, we've got Norman Bergrun saying that the ring makers of Saturn are black, not dark, black. Now, we know the element giving melanin that dark pigmentation is carbon. And with black eumelanin, you're dealing with a high quantity of pure carbon. Well, of course, science is saying that about 98.5% of our DNA doesn't code anything within our bodies or have any known purpose at all. And they call this percentage of the DNA junk DNA. And they say they don't know what it is or why it's there. They have theories, speculations, but they really don't know why so much of our DNA doesn't code. But when you look at the structure of the human DNA, you're going to see that there's so many elements bringing those DNA strands together. But the most prevalent element within the DNA is carbon. Each individual section of the DNA is made up of about 5 carbon atoms. So it would seem like all of that carbon making up a good amount of our DNA would be linked to these missing elements within us. And that all of that carbon is actually that 98.5% of our DNA that they consider to be junk DNA. And again, we know when you're talking about a high amount of carbon in human beings, black eumelanin cannot be discounted. And think about it. They're saying that about 98.5% of our DNA is this junk DNA. Then they're also saying that 98.9% of the physical world is composed of carbon-12. So only a small percentage of our DNA, which is mostly carbon-based, is actually coded. And only a small percentage of the physical world is made up of carbon-13. It just seems to fit. And it's almost like carbon-13 is the junk DNA in our DNA strand, and possibly the parts of our DNA that connects us to these black beings, these ring makers of Saturn.